They aren't the people who send other people's kids to war. They're the people who get sent to war. And we felt an obligation to them to explain why that might happen. We were determined to scrutinize the administration's case for war as closely as we possibly could, and that's what we set out to do.
So as he listened to pundits and officials talking about Saddam Hussein's supposed connections to 9/11, Walcott was skeptical.
It was not clear to us why anyone was asking questions about Iraq in the wake of an attack that had al-Qaeda written all over it.
He assigned his two top reporters to investigate the claims. Between them, Warren Strobel and Jonathan Landay had more than 40 years' experience reporting on foreign affairs and national security. They had lots of sources to call on.
We were basically, I think, hearing two different messages from. It was a message that the public message the administration was giving out about Iraq, its WMD, the fact it was an immediate threat, grave threat, gathering threat. But that was so different from what we were hearing from people on the inside, people we'd known in many cases for years and trusted.
They went about their reporting the old-fashioned way, with shoe leather, tracking down and meeting with sources deep inside the intelligence community.
When you're talking to the working grunts, uniformed military officers, intelligence professionals, professional diplomats, those people are more likely than not always of course, but more likely than not to tell you some version of the truth and to be knowledgeable about what they're talking about when it comes to terrorism or the Middle East and things like that.
Strobel learned that within 2 weeks after 9/11, senior intelligence officers were growing concerned that the Bush administration was stretching little bits and pieces of information to connect Saddam Hussein to al-Qaeda with no hard evidence.
There was a lot of skepticism among our editors because what we were writing was so at odds with what most of the rest of the Washington press corps was reporting. And some of our papers, frankly, just didn't run the stories. They have access to the New York Times wire and the Washington Post, wire, and they chose those stories instead.
Within the month, Strobel found out the Pentagon had already dispatched James Woolsey to Europe, looking for any shred of evidence to incriminate Hussein.
He did this even knowing that the CIA had already analyzed this carefully and found no such links. So the more I thought about that, the more it just didn't seem to make sense.
Knight Ridder's early skepticism was a rarity inside the Beltway bubble.
A decision to go to war, even against an eighth-rate power such as Iraq, is the most serious decision that a government can ever make. And it deserves the most serious kind of scrutiny that we in the media can give it. Is this really necessary? Is it necessary to send our young men and women to go kill somebody else's young men and women?
That meant asking questions about the sources of information the press and government were relying on, including, notably, this man, Ahmed Chalabi. After the first Gulf War, Americans had installed Chalabi as the leader of Iraqi exiles seeking regime change in Baghdad. Now he was all over Washington as the administration's and the neoconservatives' star witness against Saddam.
Chalabi's motives were always perfectly clear in this, and understandable. He was an Iraqi. He didn't want his country run by a thug and a murderer, a mass murderer, and a crook. And everything he said had to be looked at in that light and scrutinized in that light. And why anyone would give him a free pass, or anyone else a free pass for that matter, on a matter as important as going to war is beyond me.
Chalabi was a creature of American propaganda to a large degree. It was a American company, the Rendon Group, that working secretly with the CIA, basically created his organization, the Iraqi National Congress, and put Chalabi in charge, basically.
James Bamford is an independent journalist whose specialty is the intelligence world.
From the very beginning, Chalabi was paid a lot of money from the U.S. taxpayers. The CIA paid him originally about $350,000 a month to Chalabi and his organization. The CIA finally caught on in the mid-90s that Chalabi was a con man, basically, and they dropped him.
Chalabi's handlers in Washington were not deterred by that stain on his credibility. He charmed Congress out of millions more dollars for his cause and had the press eating out of his hand.
He made a lot of friends in the media, and he convinced a lot of people that he was legitimate, even though the CIA had dropped him.
When Chalabi made selected Iraqi defectors available to the press, it was a win-win game. The defectors got a platform, journalists got big scoops.
There was a big effort, in fact, to find people who seemed to have credible evidence about what was going on inside Iraq. Because, in fact, if you could find somebody who was credible talking about a nuclear program in Iraq or chemical weapons, that would be a big story.
And it worked. The New Yorker, USA Today, The Washington Post, The New York Daily News, The New York Times. And on PBS, just 2 months after 9/11, Frontline and The New York Times teamed up for a documentary on the defectors.
Captain Saba Kodada is a former Army officer who defected from Iraq. He made a crude drawing of what he says is a terrorist training camp on the outskirts of Baghdad.
There were caveats.
And a further caution. These defectors have been brought to Frontline's attention by one group of Iraqi dissidents, the INC, the Iraqi National Congress.
But the caveats couldn't compete with the spectacular tales told by defectors.